5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Political Theology and the Crisis of Liberalism. This is going to be a panel where we go through and discuss select issues initially treated in John Milbank's 2013 book, Beyond Secular Order, concerning the relationship between the metaphysical presuppositions of modern philosophy and modern politics and the political theologies underlying political ideas guiding the development of liberal modernity.
Thanks very much, Anna, and welcome the hundreds of people who are here in the hall and the thousands of people online and the millions of people that are going to listen to the recording. We're sitting facing an enormous portrait of Charles I, King and Martyr, and behind us is Cardinal Wolsey, who both have historic associations with this very small town in the East Midlands, where Byron was brought up, and which has had more history than it should have had for its size. And we're in the very historic Great Hall attached to the Bishop's Palace of the cathedral. And as Anna has said, this is about a day about metaphysics and politics, and also about post-liberalism and the left. And back in 2016, Adrian Pabst, who's sitting to my left, and myself wrote a rather long book on politics of virtue, subtitled Post-liberalism and the Human Future, in which we tried to set out what a possible post-liberalist future might be, but a lot has happened since then, but probably we stick by our basic theses. And to some extent, behind that stood radical orthodoxy and a summary in Beyond Secular Order of how I thought that radical orthodoxy's theses about metaphysics might connect to its theses about politics. And broadly speaking, the assumption in that book was that any society, any civilization, in the way it lives and performs everything, is also representing reality, the kind of thing that philosophers like Vergin or Collingwood have put forward. And then you get philosophers more specifically, in theory, representing reality. And the supposition of the book was rather that mediating between those things, the practical representation of reality and the theoretical, is political philosophy. That somehow political philosophy has one foot in the reflection on what's going on, and another foot in metaphysics. And so I singled out 4 different categories: university representation, populism, and different theories of causality, concursors versus influentia.
Possibilism?
Well, I mentioned possibilism.
Sorry, I heard it was populism.
Sorry, possibilism. No, they're kind of different. But maybe they're not. But anyway, and we're going to build the 4 sessions today round those 4 categories. So we're going to begin with university, which is, if you like, something like the master presuppositions. So that before each session, I'm going to try to briefly summarize how I linked the metaphysical with the political in the book around those 4 categories. So starting off with university, the overriding metaphysical assumption of modernity is of the university of being, of which nominalism is the radicalization. This implies a flat, reductive atomism, which then translates into political terms. In those terms, there are only isolated individuals possessing wills, or else there are mass impersonal forces. But only in our day is this politics being fully realised. Its results are contested by religious and populist forces which are inevitably deemed irrational in terms of their questioning of a univocalist politics. Yet university is itself only an assumption, indeed originally a theological assumption in origin. The alternative view is of a connected, mediated, analogical, paradoxical cosmos imbued with inherent purpose from dust to the stars to God, which the social order should reflect. Above all, this implies relationality and mediating institutions, the linking role of the few, both corporate bodies and the wise dispersed throughout all society, between the dispersed many and the controlling one. Now, since Adrian and I wrote the book, post-liberalism has come much more to the fore, but I think it's really questionable whether we've got any serious post-liberalism in practice at the moment. In terms of the left, we have a questioning, of course, of neoliberalism, but overwhelmingly a cultural liberalism and individualism, with very few serious proposals for what might displace a liberal economics. And I think the core of post-liberalism, as Adrian and I saw it, was questioning both the cultural liberalism of the left and the economic liberalism of the right, and seeing those as being in secret collusion with each other. But insofar as today post-liberalism seems to be mainly talked about on the right, there's very extensive questioning of cultural liberalism, but really very, very little questioning of economic liberalism, indeed sometimes a hearty embrace of it. And that tends to undermine the seriousness of the questioning of cultural liberalism, because ultimately you just cannot separate it from the dominance of a capitalist economics, which gets ever more extreme. Every time capitalism runs into crisis, it always responds by commodifying even further reality. In other words, its response is always to intensify capitalism in order to escape from crisis. But what I think we don't face up to enough, and this would include the whole of Marxist materialism, is the underlying metaphysical assumptions that we both perform and articulate. Above all, this is univocity, the idea that being is simply there or not there, and it's always there in the same manner, in the same degree. And building on univocity, this means it's very hard to believe in the existence of real universals or real forms or real ideas that bind things together. You land up with only individuals. It becomes very hard to believe in real relations either. Analogy implies something hovering between identity and difference. It's inherently paradoxical. So an extreme rationalism tends to dissolve that, and you're just left with anatomism, and finally it becomes linked with scientific atomism, but then also with political atomism. There are disconnected individuals. You either think of that in very materialist terms, or incoherently you talk about the fact that they have wills that are simply wills to power. They're not in any sense teleological wills. And if you want to think beyond individualism, then you have to think in terms either of kind of very impersonal forces, or else an aggregation of all these individual wills. So ideas of democracy, in that sense, tend to be restricted to an idea of the aggregation of many wills and then rules of majorities, which then can, of course, override individual rights. And liberal democracy then lands up with no real ability to mediate between the dignity of the individual on the one hand and the common good of everybody on the other hand. And this extends also to Marxism, I think, that although Marxism is somehow has very heavy elements of romanticism and German idealism, rather sort of incoherently mixed with its materialist assumptions, it doesn't really escape the univocalist and nominalist assumptions of modernity in their materialist guise, rather than in their originally theological guise, where somehow an arbitrary God is just manipulating all these things. But once you've got rid of that arbitrary God, you tend to be left with materialism. And there's a really great article in New Left Review, which I read New Left Review religiously because it's so intelligent, even though I disagree ultimately with Marxism. And Aaron Banana in that has a really great article, which roughly speaking is saying that socialism has never really escaped from productivism, or the idea that you're only trying to pursue pragmatic goals of more efficient production, more abundance, more sort of material well-being. And he rightly says, drawing to some extent on earlier texts of Marx, like the critique of the Goethe program, but shouldn't, socialism be pursuing, more plural set of values, like, also beauty, also artistic creativity, also, maybe refusing certain forms of technology if they lead to a less fulfilling life or damaging nature. And that, as he says, all these things involve trade-offs. You might choose to have a less materially rich life, but a more meaningful one, and so on. And then he argues that even after you've sort of got over capitalism in whatever sense, you would still have, these debates left. And I think he's right about that. And you would still have politics out. But where I think this sort of Marxist materialism then breaks down is, well, if we're talking about values, what do we mean? Are values simply things that change and that people vote on? In which case they're not really values. A value is a value because in some sense, and whatever the metaphysics here, it's objective. So for example, you have to believe there is such a thing as beauty to be pursuing beauty. You have to believe there's such a thing as art that can be relatively good or bad. You have to believe there's such a thing as genuine creativity and it's worthwhile. And it's very difficult to validate these things unless in some sense you have a spiritualist metaphysics, some kind of spiritual realism, as the French tend to call it. And I also think he's wrong to say, he lands up with a kind of proceduralism, after all, which is liberal. That we're not saying what values are, but we are saying there are going to be democratic procedures to get there. But how's that going to stop, the strong overriding the weak? And don't we need some kind of minimum of value agreement even to get the society going in the first place? And what do we do about the fact that initially values are proposed, put forward, they're not voted on? So there's you don't have a democracy that's a mise en abîme. There's always an element of, if you like to put it this way, aristocratic proposal. And I think this is where, Adrian and I's politics become sort of left conservative, that we believe that with Aristotle, mixed government is ineradicable, that you have to think about having an honourable set of influences. You have to, even to have a democracy that's not manipulated, there has to be a non-democratic pursuit of the true, the good and the beautiful, and institutions to try to guarantee that. So I think that's, to my mind, the limit at that point. To which I would, just add as a matter for discussion, are we advocating a form of socialism or not? And I think that incredibly much depends on how you define socialism. That if you define socialism as strictly ruling out all profit and all investment for profit, then there's a sense in which the Catholic Church is right to say, no, we're not socialists, because we still allow for that, but we criticise capitalism because we're trying to get over a market totally dominated by capitalism. And yet then it becomes a question of whether you can have some notion of, okay, profits are an investment there can be legitimate, just levels that allow sort of rewarding you for the effort you've put in the investment of your resources that you've made, and that are in that sense equivalent almost to salaries, but have to, or also looking towards sort of future production. And it's interesting that Barnett stresses the degree to which even Keynes and Beveridge seem to be proposing that there will be ultimately no profit and only investment for production or for utilitarian purpose. And yet he himself is sort of questioning whether that's really possible. Once you get beyond a utilitarian kind of framework, and there are multiple values that we have to debate about and try to integrate, even if we think they're objective, then don't you have to have a much more kind of distributed sense of investment and some element of competition? And doesn't it become, this is something else Adrian and I would add, at that point doesn't it become somewhat corporatist, that you are not totally dividing the economic from the political function? You're seeing all firms as participating, partly aristocratically, partly democratically, in the discernment of values. And this is happening at a local level, it's happening within businesses and so on. And then the role of the state becomes, well, certainly strategic, and national investment banks and things are definitely required, and yet not quite so centralised as Keynes said. So this would be, if you like, my sort of Christian, Catholic, Anglican, Orthodox, whatever, a kind of gloss on what more sort of thinking Marxists are trying to say at this point. So, over to everybody else for discussion.
So one thing that I think helps to think through the role of university and analogy in this particular discussion is the philosopher Gilles Deleuze as a foil. That he has a particular metaphysics that is sort of like, in some ways it's kind of almost like hyper-liberal, but it's also critical of capitalist liberalism, kind of post-Marxist. And it's building off of this basis of scotistic university and specifically translates it into this metaphysical idea of a plane of immanence, which I feel like is kind of the one of the key kind of constricting features of that sort of liberal formalism. But there's also, even in Deleuze's kind of like more like radical left-wing modernist metaphysics, there's sort of this reduction of reality to a kind of formal immanence, where there is a lot of, even if there are kind of singularities that are expressed in that space, the means of those singularities kind of participating in an actual kind of collective collective movement towards transcendence is undermined. So I feel like, I guess one of the kind of questions that I want to address in this discussion is what specifically is the role of some kind of both concept and pragmatically instantiated idea of transcendence, including like spiritual, religious transcendence, but as also social transcendence, in sort of undermining, I guess, this reductive idea that society has to operate sort of in a way that is appealing to the plane of immanence that each kind of person is reflexively drawn into.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with Deleuze, and people, completely secular people like Badiou pointing this out, it doesn't seem to relate to any sort of transformative political program, because in the end you have this contrast between a sort of monistic force, kind of naturans, that is sort of always limited by difference. It endlessly expresses itself as difference, but it's also halted by difference. So that all you can do is a sort of endless establishment and overcome. It's an incredibly apolitical vision, in contrast to Badiou, who seems at a pinch prepared to dump university, which is interesting. And he somehow his whole idea of an event is somehow and almost problematically not in continuity with the natural, but we have to be loyal to the event. We have to repeat it differently and develop it. And although he tries to keep that within the bounds of materialism, the lure of both Paul and Plato and a certain kind of Hegel seems to be so strong that, well, I myself argue you can sort of, if you read Badiou from the event backwards and not from the kind of mathematical ontology forwards, you get something that's almost like a kind of Christian compatible.
And he bases it on that.
Absolutely.
In the first chapter, it's the Christ event.
Absolutely, exactly. It's extraordinarily near conversion.
Yeah.
But
and it's interesting because Badiou actually understands, albeit incorrectly at times, that the whole postmodern critique and supposed alternative to the kind of secular modern project is in the end just a mirror image of it. So for foundationalism in modern philosophy, you get flux, but these are not fundamentally different. For sort of this idea of a rationalist, knowledge of reality, you get this sort of, ephemeral, slightly speculative ontology in postmodern philosophy, but again, they're not really alternatives, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. For this idea of, a clear sort of sense of history, you get sort of, something supposedly sort of random, but actually, what he sees is that what's missing from both modern and postmodern thinking is the universal instantiated in the particular, which for him is the event, and that is not without interest. As John and said, there is something there.
So it's that question of a paradoxical mediation that is there in romantics like Schelling, and a gambler sometimes seems to endorse
they're both gesture towards
as well.
Whereas Deleuze and others do not. They simply replace the sort of foundational in the modern with something completely virtual.
In the end,
and that's something
it's too rationalist, that we can't fully justify that kind of mediation. It's there in the work of art, but we can't sort of go beyond the kind of aesthetic intuition of it, which is, I think, why Romanticism is trying to save religion by appealing. It's not substituting art for religion. This is textbook rubbish. It's seeing that you can only salvage the religious legacy by a stronger stress on the aesthetic and the poetic. But, the people here, the hundreds of people here, do you want to come in at this point?
I could come in with something. So I'm thinking very much I've been in educational context for most of my life. And I wanted to pick up on the point about this aristocratic formative element. because I think there is a sense that's tied to the institution of education. And I want to just tease up this point about analogy in relation to how we treat STEM versus humanities divides nowadays. Because in a certain sense, if the formation that's going on in educational institutions is atomistic, is univocal, how do you realise an analogical vision which sort of, in an analogical vision, it treats quantity very differently to how we're brought up with STEM subjects. I mean, I remember the first things we were taught in science about, for example, atoms, was that these are little bits that aggregate together to form wholes, and that's not scientific.
No,
that's
quantum physics may totally contradict.
So if that's the formation that's happening, then there's, in a sense, who forms the people who form others?
It's such a really great question, and it sort of suggests, you know, the division between, in the name of science, we've got scientism, you know, dominating us. Are there any comments on that or other contributions? Alfred?
Oh, thank you.
Both. Aaron, put his hand up first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
please.
I think it's an interesting question to link it back to university. One thing I found with university is often that actually it's not necessarily the kind of what you get out of it, okay, so it leads down to outcome and so on. The things that are downstream of university are not nearly as interesting as the kind of epistemological makeup that you then end up, you know, the image of the self that you end up with, and the image of cognition that you end up with. And so in a way, sort of responding to sort of comment just before, this districting of the cognitive faculties, I think you can make two comments on it. One of them is that actually it's a result of university. So you have the idea of the aesthetic, you said it's accentuated in romanticism, that's true. Only because, of course, it's reacting to the fact that Kant has already districted all these things and said, well, this belongs to philosophy, this is purely rational, purely conceptual. And hence you have the idea, well, under univocal issue, only the issue of this very strict conceptual structure, and anything has to conform to this, and the synthesis that the imagination performs is under this concept alone. You have actually something that's far more amorphous and sublime on the other side. So you have this kind of duality there. On the other hand, how much of STEM, humanities, and so on in education are simply a result of democratizing education? Right, so the very great scientists have always had this intuitive thing. Mathematics can see, it has vision. But if you're trying to teach it, well, you know, in some sense, it has to be. So the sense we can point out the metaphysical presuppositions of university. What does it mean about cognition? What does it mean about what it is to be a scientist? To think that reality and stuff are images of reality. But on the other hand, really pragmatically, if you're designing a kind of pedagogical system, maybe you do need to have something that looks like, you know, modern images of quantity and the atom and so on and so on, because, well, actually, you can't teach your intuition.
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? So whether humanities have died because they're seen as inherently elitist, you know, so sort of things like the whole leader-side program seem to be training in good taste and morality, and then you know, the humanities manage to deconstruct that for themselves. So, and we've got to a point now where even sort of ideas of beauty seem to be elitist, and we can see all around us how beauty is disappearing. And you get some people like Malcolm Woolley seem to sort of celebrate that, you know, like, oh, Nietzsche was still trying to hang on to beauty, but, you know. So that's a really valid question, you know, the humanities do seem to suggest some kind of hierarchy. But then the tragedy is surely that, you know, a lot of that, there were whole trajectories up to people like Raymond Williams and even like Terry Eagleton today, who were surely trying to democratize what we see as the higher experiences. You know, so that if you lose hierarchy, in fact, you lose democracy in the end, because now no longer are we getting so many working class people inducted into acting and ballet and classical music and so on, or into the high levels of sports even, you know, that it's all coming from the public schools, you know, so that, and that raises another problem for me about the whole link of, any link of the left to materialism. Doesn't it, in a weird way, buy into the idea that democracy, we're only bound together by a lowest common denominator, not by a highest common factor. In other words, you know, traditionally we thought of craft and art as subordinate material activities, and yet that was challenged by the Renaissance and by Romanticism and by Ruskin and people like Eric Hell and so on. So, but in a way, left materialism sort of buys into it. It covertly buys into that idea that kind of the workers are just about material stuff. So that if, like Banana, if you rightly want to say, well, values must be plural and we must recognise diverse values, doesn't that put pressure on that kind of whole, on this kind of materialist outlook, which is, you know, clearly it's survived Marxism, that we're now, we've now got a weird mixture of liberalism and a cultural, at least, egalitarianism that say everybody's got to have an equal chance to compete in this brutal market. And so we've got this dominance of, stem cell stuff. And this offers no defence against humanism. And that's, I think, another problem about sort of the world of the New Left Review, that it doesn't seem to deal with these questions about mind, soul, free will, whereas our politics are getting more and more metaphysical. They're about life and death, what is a human being, automation and so on. So that these metaphysical questions are no longer just hovering behind in the way I was trying to talk about. They're also coming directly into the centre of politics. And again, I don't see what resources a sheer a materialist socialism has to do with those things.
And the problem is that endless separation, that irreducible dualism of matter and form, or the material and the symbolic, is just not going to lead anywhere other than to bad materialism and bad idealism. So that you get a kind of brute materialism where we're just reduced to being producers or consumers, or just sort of this brute animality, diagnosed by Agamben and others, a kind of bare individuality on the one hand, and then totally abstracted, totally virtualized sort of commodity fetishism or processes at the other hand. Whereas surely what the left needs to do is to reconnect, and actually that means produce a much better materialism and idealism than we have. Well, and at the moment it's like reason. If you're a rationalist, you end up actually reducing reason to something that isn't. Reason ultimately is open to faith, is open to the transcendent, is open to all of that. Whereas modern reason has cut itself off that. So the reintegration of the material and the symbolic is the only way the left can escape all these rabbit holes, which has gone in for 150 years. Really, positivism and utilitarianism are the two things that the left has embraced. That has led to its total intellectual and metaphysical surrender to the worst of modernity rather than equal.
It's always then outcompeted by capitalism also at the philosophical level, because it hasn't got any sufficient reason for saying why you shouldn't commodify and ratify things. Because of this, because of precisely this issue about value and it being linked to the good, and that fact is ultimately from shamans through to civilizations, there are these figures, these individuals, often even like the Buddha or Confucius or Jesus, who see these things. It's not kind of like voted. And I think in Adrian's and my book, one of the hovering debates was sort of mediating between Polanyi and Marx, that sort of, Marx, he rightly stresses that at least within capitalism, that there's a very strong role for class struggle, but, production is a side of the the extraction of surplus value from labour and so on. Perhaps it doesn't say enough about, the equal primacy of finance, which links the state and war, and then there's always a finite production tension. But I think Badiou, who was a kind of Christian socialist, always pointed to the idea of a more fundamental, and he's like Marcel Mauss in this respect, a more fundamental sort of sundering of the gift, so that a gift sort of unites matter and meaning. But what we have in modernity is pure matter on one hand, or pure abstraction on the other hand. So, and we can see this more and more in the digital age. So that capitalism is sort of predicated on this abolition of the symbolic. So, Marx says all that is sacred is being profaned, but he needs to think further at that point. He needs to see that the abandoning of the sacred is part of what generates capitalism, that it's not just a matter of class struggle, it is a matter of, how you keep order once you no longer got a symbolic order, either in terms of what you think about nature or society, so that you can only keep order by state bureaucracy or market mediation, so that the kind of the fundamental things, the metaphysical decisions, whether they're inferior or whether they're performed. So it's not exactly idealism, it's more like every society is liturgical. It's a kind of ritual performance. And yet, around the symbolic. And what you need to see is that the symbolic has been dissolved, and therefore you can't really challenge capitalism in a secular way. Ultimately, this is not possible.
I have a question.
Yeah, and then I think Alpha wants to come as well, but go ahead.
Okay, it's just like a quick question or comment. So I think throughout maybe a few hundred years, people have been saying we need to pursue goodness, truth, and beauty, and all that. People have the sense that we live in a valueless society, and the machine of capitalism, of bureaucracy. But obviously, these machines of bureaucracy and capitalism have been quite stable in themselves, and they've sort of resisted all these challenges from people who have said, we need to follow the good, true, and beautiful. So I was just wondering, why do you think now the time is more auspicious for those ideas to break through?
It's a very important question.
No, it's a very important question. I think part of the answer is that we can now see the sheer emptiness of what's being promised. So, at some point, capitalism promised endless progress just through material growth, but that's coming to an end. There's no more growth. Things are stagnating and indeed declining. We were promised more freedom. We were, ever greater freedom. And yet we can see that it's not that everyone is freer. Though there are some more freedoms today, of course, than in the past. It's that actually
even freedom of choice.
Exactly, even freedom of choice in some sense declining, because we can now see that only certain people can effectively exercise choice. Is that it comes back to Nietzsche's diagnosis that this is a sort of fusion of Nietzsche and Darwin. Now, actually, we live in a world where the will to power means that the strong will prevail over the weak, the rich will prevail over the poor, and so on and so forth.
But on Twitter nowadays,
and not just well, quite. Well, I'll come to that in just a second. So, and not just empirically, but even in terms of this is another presupposition. When you look at recent legislative efforts, in terms of assisted suicide, this is now very effectively being formalized and enshrined in the law, that this is how it should be. So we've gone from even empirically the strong are always stronger than the weak, that sort of goes without saying, whereas now the law is actually on the side of this, whereas before, there was a sense, at least for some time, say the end of World War II, the outlawing of genocide and the total condemnation of the Holocaust, that the state had a kind of protective role.
Yeah.
The state was there to protect the vulnerable. Now the state is increasingly on the other side. It's an extraordinary turnaround, which I think people will resist when they see the consequences. And then there is absolutely what you were just hinting at, which is the whole sort of spectacle. What sort of Guido Bloch calls the society of the spectacle. it's a total illusion, and people can now see that actually material degradation is all we get.
Yeah.
So we don't even get the material progress we were promised, never mind any sense of fulfillment, any sense of joy, any sense of true happiness. And when you have neither the symbolic promise that commodities replace real, liturgically celebrated goods, and when there's material decline as opposed to material progress, I think people will increasingly resist this.
Yeah.
So it's also that, reality is caught up in some sense with the promise because, and this is the point made by Jean-Paul Michel, that liberalism turns its own presuppositions into reality. It starts with the assumption that there's a war against all, and then it ends up producing it, right? It starts with the assumption that we're sort of self-owning animals, the Lockean thing, and now this is all we have, the kind of promise that we can just own ourselves and everything, and this is now with abortion and euthanasia exactly where we got to, and that is not a reality most people want to inhabit.
Yeah.
Why? Because there is a natural yearning for beauty, for truth and for goodness, and that natural yearning isn't going to be totally destroyed even by the processes of stable market that we get. And so if we can speak to that human yearning, right, both in religious and in secular ways, because even people who aren't of faith, of course, have metaphysical sensibility.
I do believe that.
Then I think we can start bringing that together, so that the fusion or the reconnecting of the material and the symbolic will not produce materialism and idealism. It will absolutely produce the sort of sense of cosmic celebration of the beautiful, the good, and the true.
And one thing I'd just like to say to that is I ultimately believe that's kind of true, that the manifestation of this ultra-liberalism and capitalism will show its bad effects, and I think people will see the truth of that. But it is a bit of a risk, because a lot of things what you've said kind of also just demonstrate the complete power of this system that is ever more encroaching into our lives.
Oh, yeah.
So I see what you're saying. It could reveal this bad thing, but there's also the danger that it's literally putting more and more power every day.
Oh, totally. The less we have some kind of embedded liberalism, where in reality we're still actually kind of medieval, if you like, the more you've got pure liberalism, the more you are seeing, a reaction against it. But as I've said, in the case of capitalism, in the case of liberalism in general, it tends to respond by doubling down. So that you're right, that can still happen. It's not. This isn't a prophecy.
But it's, I can't say we were all concrete.
It's a more extreme conflict.
But I think just because both can be true, the more and more capitalism doubles down, the more and more liberalism doubles down, the more and more forces like fascism double down, the more we can then also see what really is at stake. And it's not precisely the question of, are we talking about liberal democracy? So, it's about true democracies under threat by all sorts of forces, both liberal and non or anti-liberal. And the question is, who's on the side of genuine democracy? By which we don't mean the rule of majorities or worse, mob rule. No, we mean this kind of fusion of the one, the few, and the many, so that you get democracy in the sense of, vox populi, vox Dei, not in the sense of a formal procedural democracy, which can be easily hollowed out as we see. Who's really on the side of the human as opposed to the transhuman or the totally anti-human? Who's really on the side of dignity, not in a Kantian sense, but in a kind of sense of the true intrinsic worth and value of humans just because they're made in the image and likeness of God, and so on and so forth. So we'll see the true opposition, and so the more capitalism unfolds, the more I think we can also mobilise against that in favour of mutualist markets, in favour of regeneration of value, good business, business that is both economic and ethical, and hence much more sustainable than the sort of short-term profit maximization.
There's two parts to that, because waiting for a bad idea to die is one part, and bad ideas, I suppose, we will hope, not a lot of the universe is would eventually die. But there's also the other aspect is you have to kill it.
Did Alfred did you make your point, Alfred?
Oh, no, it's fine. There's lots to sort through. But I begin, I suppose, just with the easiest one to get through, which was to say, in response to the NLR politics point, I think you've seen in the tradition of the left from the Enlightenment onwards a reduction of the horizon of the scope of conversation. Whereas previously, disputes were metaphysical. By the time we reach real existing socialism, the hot disputes that are taking place in the New Left Review in the 60s and 70s are restricted to the avenue of the historical, and then finally to culture, and now what we have today, which is vibes, which is people. Yeah, people get good vibes or bad vibes about whether something is in or is out, and these are these set the terms for a debate that is held to be as weighty within this subcultural political clique as metaphysical precepts or serious historical debate once was. Now, my interest was piqued by the question about whether this is an auspicious time to be making this particular case. I think, as Adrian has said, so long as we are aware that there are certain things that are ineradicable and universally true, we will always be aware that there is a political duty to appeal to those ineradicable and universally true characteristics. Nevertheless, that doesn't make me necessarily optimistic about there being conditions that are unique to the present moment that make such a time auspicious for making that critique. Quite on the contrary, I think the extent to which there has been a totalising capture of all hitherto known human institutions by whatever you want to call it, capital, the machine. If anything, we're at our weakest particular juncture. But then again, so were Munster's peasants, so were the Hussites. I think I'm drawn to Zizek's interpretation of Badiou's event, which is to say that when revolutionary change occurs, it will occur all of a sudden out of nowhere. No one will quite expect how or why. And that's rather like grace.
Or is growth.
Yes, and so I think while we have a moral duty to appeal to the souls of this world and to say, let us explain why you should not be persecuting those you should not be persecuting. Let us make a compelling intellectual case to discover what it is that we know that is creating the image of God inside you. We will, I think in truth, we will end up relying on Damascene conversions, at least as much as we will the boring business of door knocking and leafleting.
I think also that's completely right, and it is exactly that. It is grace rather than, human volition. But I think there is something else, which is these events, as you say, could happen at any moment. And then the question also is there a certain readiness? Which is absolutely not at the same metaphysical level, but it's nevertheless required. Because we've had lots of openings. I mean, let's face it, the financial crisis, the Yellow Vest movement, in France, we can point to a number of events where things could have taken a very different turn, and yet they haven't. And they haven't, I think, in large part because there was no readiness. Yeah. There was no, cultural, institutional, political, social readiness to really respond to some of those events. And my fear is that there could be more events going forward, and again, there wouldn't be the readiness. So I think there's also, it's incumbent on us to prepare for this reason. Whenever we've seen a different settlement, the post-war settlement, the sort of, Thatcherite, Reaganite settlement, whether we want to call it neoliberal or something else, or going further back in time, there was a lot of intellectual work, a lot of groundwork that had happened, so that certain elites were ready to seize moments. And I fear that one of the greatest tragedies of our age is that there's no readiness because we haven't got quite the intellectual foundations yet, though I think we are building them.
Indeed.
And so the more we have a body of work, and then of course organisations and mobilisations and all the things where I think you're right, which we at the moment don't have. We don't have the institutions that people had in 45 or in 79 to seize moments. But the intellectual as well as the institutional groundwork needs to happen as well, because otherwise we will not respond to the events in the right sort of way. And in fact, every time that there's been an event, I'll finish on this, what we see is actually it's got worse afterwards. After the financial crisis, we had austerity, right? After Yellow Vest, we had a doubling down of technocracy, which was then amplified by not COVID itself. That couldn't be a communitarian moment. I think there were elements of that, but the overwhelming response to COVID was to double down on technocracy, to double down on state surveillance. So the worst element of the system prevailed, not the better ones. The question then is, what are the conditions for the better, for the better elements to prevail rather than the worse ones? And I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's what we need to collectively work out.
I'm curious about when we talk about there being a cadre of sufficiently ready. Ready is a really good word, I think, more than right or organised or ready, because readiness is a term that encompasses a number of pragmatic and principled dispositions. The ready militant is one who knows what he ought to be doing and how he ought to be doing it, or she. But it puts me in mind of the Vanguard Party. It puts me in mind of the notion of an organised kind of cadre. And I think people make a mistake when they look at, say, another case where there was an enormous amount of doubling down and numerous events whereby revolutionary change was possible but was then crushed by the system, and that would be looking at late Tsarist Russia from 1905 onwards. There were many moments where things could have changed, and then suddenly there was one moment that did indeed change everything. What was interesting, rather, was that while people would make the assumption that the cadre of well-organised people was just made up of bourgeois intellectuals like Lenin or Trotsky, the reason it was possible was because they had marching with them a large group of ideologically committed ordinary working people. And those ordinary working people would have had reading habits and political beliefs that were, even if on paper they could not quote as many, they did not read as much political material as the average Twitter user does today. In the era of hyper-political kind of vibes-based politics, the person that appears highly radical, highly politicised, is not in fact a very ready political militant. In fact, they're very ready to just put their phone back in their pocket and to move on to the next debate when it hits the pages of the New Statesman or their timeline. There were once people who, despite their economic status, and despite their relative lack of formal education or exposure to information, nevertheless bore a political will, readiness that is, I think, a little more disparate today. And so the question, I suppose, would be, is it possible to think of a modern solution in the left to that question of political readiness, to encouraging people who are stupefied and hypnotised?
We don't have a peasantry, we don't have an industrial revolution. We should probably ask
Questions from the Zoom audience.
Zoom audience.
So if you have a question and you're on Zoom, just write it into the chat and August will read it out. So I'll give like a minute or two if anyone has any questions.
Or we can deal with them later in the next session. Meanwhile, Aaron, you can...
That's okay, yeah. I want to break down this idea of militant party vanguard, the auspicious moment and so on. In terms of its sort of metaphysical architecture, it rounds up our discussion quite nicely, I think. We talked about exchange proceduralism in the democratic process. And I think any time there's proceduralism, there's something, there is some movement in some direction that being obscured. So, two people meet, they say, well, there's exchange, there's something that's going on that is, and Marx shows around presuppositions of kind of exchange and not, recognised by classical political economy. And I'm thinking about, well, what are the nefarious processes underlying our proceduralism today? Particularly those of democratic process. Well, a vote is just a vote, right? Well, no, actually, there's huge amounts of cultural influence that are causing a society that is on the decline. And we see that in terms of the context of the TV that's on our screens and the internet and so on. So if there's a kind of process, there's a movement overall behind exchange, behind just the idea, I'm just expressing my opinion. You have the question in Deleuze then of, well, what is the question of limit and transgression? And of course, Deleuze has this, and you said it's very different from Marxism, it's very different from liberalism, because sort of liberal is just an anarchist who's had enough, right? To have all these kinds of holes that are loosened, except the ones that I don't like. And had liberation up to a certain point, I don't really want it anymore. You might see this with, for instance, the LGB, but we don't want T, all the extra stuff. There's a certain amount of liberation, but we must stop at a certain point. And for Deleuze, there's a kind of transcendental advantage of this. Is actually, no, why is discipline or any kind of restriction whatsoever? Why that at all? You have this very intensely metaphysical argument that actually, well, let's just not have restriction. Every time restriction comes, let's try and break it open. And so this is percolated all the way through the life, from being, as Dan Hufford said, very disciplined thinkers and so on, to, discipline in a very sort of real sense, these people who are committed, to have a vibes-based kind of slop morality today, where essentially restriction is too difficult, and that's why it's fascism. Any kind of moment where you go, actually, I don't like this. If you're used to taking, if you like the idea, and I mean that psychologically, spiritually, that actually morals are becoming loosened, and you can do whatever you want, but you can still have your fill of kind of moralization whenever you like it. You might sort of not like age gap relationships, you find it very problematic, but you might be in one, and actually those two things completely compatible. And so, for the left at the moment, it's a very sort of radical peripheries, any restriction whatsoever is fascism. And that is a metaphysical thing, and it comes through, and it also felt very viscerally. And so,
It's the will to deterritorialise, right?
it's the will to deterritorialise. And but this is shown in their libidinal, or let's say that our libidinal circuitry. Like Paul says, the law is what gives the symbol.
But of course, the irony is that if you actually say, any restriction is fascism, which means, it's a total imposition of individual will, that itself, of course, is a fascist move. So now you're dealing with two forms of fascism.
Well,
And that's the situation we find ourselves in. In some sense, we have a liberal fascism which is based on, just individual volition without any restrictions, right? And then you've got fascism that comes in and says, no, in the name of whatever state power or ethnicity, or whatever supposed principle, we're going to restrict certain rights and freedoms. But you're ultimately dealing with unmediated, absolute forms of power, and that is, of course, the reason also why this secular modernity cannot last is that total power ultimately will collapse because it destroys the conditions of its very existence. It's like liberalism, it cuts off the ground to which it sits. It cuts off the non-liberal religious culture that actually enables it. And at some point, it will collapse. Now, not necessarily in a single event, but there will be this endless hollowing out, this endless degradation. And then you will get to a form of anarchy, so back to the war of all against all, to which the response will always be a form of tyranny. So again, we know that tyranny doesn't last forever, so that's why we're in this endless oscillation. And the hope is that rather than staying in the oscillation between anarchy and tyranny, that we can escape, right, and build something different. I believe there's a question online.
Yeah, is there questions?
Yeah, there's one from Old Gambat. Saying, what are the transitional theological steps from Lutheran thought to Neoplatonic frameworks? To what extent can the traditional Vatican structure evolve, and through what processes do new theological currents typically arise? That's an question.
Sorry, what was the last sentence?
To what extent can the traditional Vatican structure evolve, and through what processes do new theological currents typically arise?
So this actually gets at something I was about to intervene and say in an earlier discussion, but I'll just kind of go over very briefly. So in your discussion, I forgot your name.
Alfred.
Alfred. So
Great.
Alfred, wait, not yet.
Have you burnt no cake?
So this question of the events, which we see in Jacques or Badiou, or the concept of materialistic grace, which is a way that Badiou talks about this concept of the events. I think that this just brings us right back to the debates about the theology of grace, which were at the center of the Reformation. And so the whole kind of struggle over like the accusations of Pelagianism that the Lutherans leveled against the Catholics, that there's too much human participation in grace, and it's not all coming from God in this kind of hyperbolic way that the Lutherans emphasized. I think that this is actually a very fundamental, practical, social, political, personal issue all the way down. And so it's sort of this question of how much human engagement is there, how much are we just sort of giving it all completely to God, or is there some kind of active service? I think this is a lot of what's at stake in the legacy of the Reformation. And there, I guess, in a sense, there's a Neoplatonic kind of the world disappears kind of aspect in some of the Protestant accounts of grace that happens. And you kind of lose the sense of there is kind of, there's even a pro-human aspect. There's a very anti-humanistic edge to some of the Reformation theology. And we see this with Nick Land, the sort of hyper-capitalist, sort of post-Deleuzian, who appeals to the Protestant Reformation and the idea of perpetual schism as the foundation of capitalism. So what's interesting with that, I think, is just to wrap up before we move on to the next section, is that how we even think about the event in the political context. Is it sort of completely coming from God, or in a way that is totally disrupting our investments in kind of the imminent frame, the planet imminence or whatever? Or is there a way that we can also kind of participatorily sanctify that, even if it is ultimately God that's doing it, or it is ultimately something beyond our immanence, are we so attached to that immanence that it's just this violent bringing us out of it, or can we actually open ourselves to it in a sort of way that involves some activity? I think this is a very, very important question that hasn't really been fully addressed in the ways that I'd like to see it addressed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all that is true. That sort of there is somehow a mainline Protestant risk that you are secularizing or instrumentalizing the whole world by sort of losing its sacramentality and the idea of the kind of synergy between divine grace and direction. This is to condemn all Protestants, because in reality, in all Protestant denominations, there was often a big retrieval of sort of Renaissance and Neoplatonic elements, which I'd see as, positive and participatory, because so that the kind of the Renaissance reform, if you like to put it that way, that was kind of a more generous sense of pagan anticipation of Christianity, and a stronger re-emphasis of the Neoplatonic synthesis which brings Aristotle and Plato together in the face of late medieval, very dubious, sort of pure Aristotelianism that isn't really authentic, and this kind of univocal nominalism. So that I think that increasingly we see that the mainline Reformation is kind of the victim of both nominalism and pure nature. As this idea that there is a sort of natural end independent of our supernatural testimony, which then renders grace, as Catholic theologians put it, extrinsicist and so on, and then makes religion a sort of independent department, not integrated, and this is all a total catastrophe, but which affected, often elements of the Counter-Reformation as well. But, the Pope can be as extrinsic an authority as the Bible. And so, the more insightful people, this would include people like Leibniz, see that there's a failure. We needed a Renaissance-y kind of Reformation, and a more Platonic kind of Hermetic Reformation.
This also connects
carry on now.
This connects to the question of aesthetic judgment and kind of the whole vibes or whatever. Is that I think that this is very integrally connected to the beautiful and the sublime, and that distinction and how that sort of operates culturally.
Absolutely.
You can see a lot of kind of the atheist metaphysics with which people like Badiou or even Agamben in a certain way. There is sort of, I think, maybe still a lot of this investment in kind of the postmodern cult of the sublime, which has this element also of this deeply extrinsic kind of it's coming from totally.
It's just like you hypostasize the unknown, and it's the same in Heidegger. You call it being, and you suppress the question of how has being come about, and so you actually subordinate being to activity and creative activity. This is where Whitehead is so superior to Heidegger. He sees that creativity is the prime reality. Now, and very important to say about this point, that the whole of radical orthodoxy was never a sort of restore pre-modernity project, but on the contrary, make everything more modern, because the real modernity is this kind of Renaissance, romantic modernity, that more recognizes metamorphosis, creativity, change, transformation in this sort of almost Davidian way that the Middle Ages did, but thinks that you can keep this within a participatory framework. So, this is why theologic Neoplatons, Arugula and so on, and why Nicholas Accuser is so sort of absolutely central, that indeed already in Accuser there's something like the Baconian program that we're going to transform nature, but we're also going to kind of increase beauty, and we're going to somehow heal the fall. It's almost a good kind of transhumanism, but it's within this Christian Neoplatonic participatory framework. And my idea would be that this is always the more radical modernity, so that everything like Descartes, Kant, and all that is an attempt to sort of suppress change and the dominance of process, as Weinberg put it, in the name of a very static epistemology. So we're confined within the finite for Kant, where there's this static framework that's sort of rationalist or something like that. And then you're this is the whole radical orthodox idea of sort of spatialization, that that modernity suppresses time, but because it's trying to have an immanent absolute.
As fast as possible.
So if you get rid of God and you want stability, you have to make something immanent absolute. And whereas if you have the idea of transcendence, that what is the eternal is remote and you don't quite grasp it, you can do justice to time and change. You don't. There isn't pure transformation. There are patterns. There's an integration between change and form. Beyond any idea of absolutizing process theology or something like that. But nonetheless, I think this is what radical orthodoxy is always trying to say, that we need a real modernity, which would be something like a religious and indeed a Christian modernity. If we see Christianity as somehow making the esoteric exoteric, God himself has appeared in humanity, as the transformative force that's miraculous, resurrecting things, So this is what kind of, Russian sociology, and the best side of Russian cosmism, it's in continuity with Bacon and Nicholas of Cusa at this point. But it's this wild side that we now have to explore, I think. Anyway, we've gone over time.
Yes.
No, just one question.
Okay.
It raises a very big issue in this talk about Reformation, because you look at like Protestantism, and the way we look at things, like if something comes into being and is a massive movement and dominates hundreds of years of history and is so significant, like its telos needs to be fulfilled, its end needs to be fulfilled. So to make like Protestantism in its broad structure, this sort of hyperbolic belief in like a sort of transcendental God mixed with a sort of immanence and desacralization. If that was a thing, which it was a thing, and it dominated hundreds of years of our history, you have to kind of think, well, what is its fulfillment? Where does it end? Because you can't just say, let's ignore it, let's sort of go back to the medieval times, let's go back to even Renaissance humanist times. It's like all these Oliver Cromwell types, whoever, it made Britain what it was, and all these. So I think the question is, what is the end of that Protestantism? And I think this is where post-liberalism becomes kind of epic, because I do think the end is a sort of merging between Protestantism and Catholicism.
Well, I think we have to suffer its effects, and of course, you've got a Quaker background, and in fact, there's a huge amount of this sort of Renaissance stuff within Quakerism. But we really have to move on now to Adrian's session. So first of all, let me find this if I can.
We have some questions.
Well,
Yeah, we don't have time for the
yes. We can deal with those questions later. So we're going on to the abyss of representation session now. So university implies that knowledge is representation, a precise mirroring of a circumscribable reality. This so-called epistemology has displaced an older mode of knowledge by identity with the thing known, based on the assumption of an analogical continuity between nature and mind. Our politics then can be described as epistemological, a democratic representation of aggregated wills with a contested margin of individual rights. But it turns out that without a core of identity, politics becomes impossible. We no longer agree enough even to disagree, which is why party politics, say in America, is breaking down into a rumbling war. One cannot decide at the ballot box radical riffs concerning life, death, gender, and the relation to nature between, for example, secular people on the one hand and religious people on the other. And mere representation plus rights, a so-called disembedded liberalism, implies nihilism. We seem to need an alternative view of representation rooted in theology, such that the one, many, and few are bound together by some common horizon of belief that allows rulers to be acceptable representatives, both symbolically and interpretatively. So it's now going to go to Adrian.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, John, and I really want to thank Anna and August for putting this on. It's really wonderful. And to everyone here in the room, the hundreds, the thousands online, the millions, as has been said, who will watch this.
And that institute.
Exactly. I generally think that, linking the metaphysical to the political is exactly where not just the left has to go, but democracy, if it wants to survive and indeed in time to thrive, because it's very clear that democracy isn't just going through one of its periodic crises. We've had periodic crises of democracy for as long as we've had democracy. Whether it's the collapse of public trust in politicians. Or more fundamentally in institutions, whether it's a lack of popular participation in the democratic process, or indeed a deep skepticism about whether the democratic system can cope with pressing problems of the here and now, or indeed longer term sort of fundamental problems, and indeed serve the long term interests of peoples and nations. We've had this in the great Depression of 1873 to 96, where democracy was under a lot of strain, obviously the interwar period, where a lot of liberal democracies ended up collapsing and sliding into totalitarianism, or again in the 70s. But today's crisis of democracy is qualitatively different. And this is certainly what John and I argued in the Politics of Virtue, because today there are, I think, quite rightly fundamental doubts as to whether we still live under substantive democracy at all, but also whether democracy and liberalism are in any way mutually compatible. And this is what we call the meta-crisis, is that the very conditions of democracy today are in doubt. Not just its functioning, not just whether it's working more or less well, and what minor reforms at the margin might be necessary, for instance, reducing the voting age. That is really a side issue. The much more fundamental issue is, do we live in a democracy at all? And how do we overcome what is increasingly apparent, that is the clash of democracy with liberalism. So in some sense you could say liberal democracy is a bit of a misnomer, because both can't be true at the same time. I'll come back to that. I think where I want to start with this, with these remarks is the fundamental point that we touched upon in the first session, which is what is so different about the dominant form of modernity, not the one we want to bring about, but the one that has been dominant. That is really a fundamental abstraction, that rather than being rooted in a reflection on experience, on reality, it starts with an abstraction. It starts with, in some sense, what there isn't. It starts with a virtual reality. It starts with the isolated individual, right? Or the kind of pure democratic process, the sort of proceduralism, as opposed to the world as it is, reality as we experience it. So Pierre Hadot is absolutely right. The big difference between the pre-modern and the modern is that the pre-modern started with reflection on reality, abstracted from it to sort of get a sense of the universal, and then returned to the particular, to try and see how the universal could inform the particular to bring about a better sort of politics or society, whatever it is. It's the allegory of the cave. You free yourself from shadows, from illusions. You discern the real, the good, the formable forms, and you bring that knowledge to bear on the way you organise society. Modernity starts with an abstraction, then goes down to some sort of, where, let's impose liberal democracy everywhere, regardless of the cultural and other circumstances, and then it retreats back to the abstract. So it just gets the whole thing the wrong way around. and it starts with this idea that somehow liberal democracy is the sort of universal model, you know, it's the end of history thesis that, of course, we had after the end of the Cold War. Not that Fukuyama is quite that simplistic. I mean, actually, he talks much more the Hegelian promise of universal emancipation, which is an interesting thesis. What, of course, we got instead, in terms of the politics, since 1989, was a sort of market emancipation, where we just extended, you know, the free, untrammeled, restricted market everywhere. It produced, you know, the most horrendous form of oligarchy in Eastern Europe. It's produced a really sinister fusion with communism in China, you know, and we are still suffering the consequences of 40 years of market, you know, free market fundamentalism in the West as well. But leaving aside what happened with the end of history thesis, what really we haven't understood is that, you know, democracy, if you want to have a true democracy, actually was always, in some sense, both much more direct and participatory on the one hand, and we've lost that, and also associative, corporatist in the sense of, you know, involving social and economic and indeed political bodies on the other hand. And the liberal democracy we've got is neither nor, and it's not even working well at the level of representation. We know, for instance, the more direct participatory form of democracy was, of course, the one we saw in ancient Athens, where political actors were actually chosen by lot rather than elected, right? And at the same time, you know, the associative, more corporatist elements have also been destroyed, you know, besides the more direct and participatory ones. Now, what do we get today? We get a form of supposedly unqualified representation. Yeah, we live in a representative democracy through elections, free, fair, and competitive, so we're told. But actually, even modern representative liberal democracy cannot escape from the fact that it does need some non-democratic elements as well. It needs something aristocratic, it needs something monarchical, right? However constituted. And even representatives are not just chosen, if you like, simply in the sense of being mandated by the people. They also are chosen because, in some sense, we still think that there should be men and women of outstanding ability and integrity and virtue, right? And that they, in turn, our elected representatives, should be led by one of their best. So that there is even, in the modern system, something in terms of aristocratic virtue. But the trouble is, we've rather seen the worst prevail. So we get, you know, instead of a virtuous aristocracy, we get a totally corrupt oligarchy. You know, instead of, you know, people actually engaging in the fundamental debates about metaphysical realities of life and death and dignity, we get you know, a political debate that's all about process and procedure, somehow mediating the clash of individual wills. So, of course, our system is not in any way aristocratic or monarchical in the good sense. But it's just to say that you cannot get away from the idea that ultimately politics, the constitutional settlement as well as the polity, are part of a mixed constitution. You're always going to have some interaction of the one, the few, and the many. We just have not exactly the one we want. And besides having, you know, an aristocracy turned a sort of corrupt oligarchy today, as with Silicon Valley, Wall Street, the City of London, sorts of other examples of corrupt elites, sadly also extending to, you know, to parts of the civil service and the state more generally. We also have, of course, the monarchical element still, because this communist idea of collective leadership is just a total myth. You know, it always comes back to one person after all. Right? There's always been a Stalin or a Mao, or nowadays the sort of digital dictatorship of Xi Jinping. You know, it's never the case that you just rule collectively. Right? The one is irreducible. And that can be a good thing. You know, we have a constitutional monarchy. But it can also be, of course, a sort of despotism in ancient times, or modern dictatorship, or the new forms of digital dictatorship that I think we increasingly see. But fundamentally, the reason why representation ends up being empty and ends up not being able to produce a polity that can be truly democratic as well as aristocratic and monarchical in a good way is because at the heart of representation in the modern sense is a clash of individual wills. And however you try and aggregate it, whether through the state or the market, whether the kind of Hobbesian, idea of the Leviathan that sort of, creates a situation where you don't have a war against all because you've delegated sovereign power, absolute sovereign power to Leviathan, or the sort of Lockean idea that, you can essentially have it through some form of, an idea that we're all self-owning animals, and ultimately, with Smith, you get a sense that the market produces something that's sort of socially optimal based on enlightened self-interest. Neither can deal with the fundamental question of what mediates between will, right? Whether purely individual or aggregated in some sense. There is no mediation in modern representation. There is no participation in something other than the immanent transcendent. And because the immanent, the absolute immanent sort of finite realm, and that therefore, without mediation and participation in something transcendent, modern representation ends up being totally empty, which is why we in the end get democracy that is procedural, legalistic, utilitarian, and that is all ultimately just a cover for the will to power. Because already with Hobbes, and again the irony is that the Hobbesian theory becomes reality in really existing liberalism, is that the freedom of the contracting individual is actually where it all happens. And so the sovereignty of Leviathan, as the expression of mass will, is in some sense the prime site for also the ideology of absolutism, because it is absolute power. And suspended between the many real wills and the will and the power of the one, you sort of have essentially liberalism that's trying to destroy mixed constitutional government. And so the shadow of absolutism always lurks over liberalism, because ultimately it cannot prevent individuals from sliding into something aggregated that becomes absolute and absolutist. Right? So the idea that liberalism is the great guardian against absolutism is one of the many modern myths we need to question. And then the other apparatus oscillation, besides individual and collective will, and where that leaves us in terms of absolutism, is whether actually we can somehow think of absolute power, either just in terms of who governs, or whether there is something like an imprescriptible and essentially unaltering law, which would then sort of provide some form of countervailing power, perhaps, to the ruler. But whether it's the ruler or the rule itself, whether one or the other is taken as absolute, can they really be seen as safeguards? Can they really help us sort of save democracy, modern democracy, from itself? But again, the problem here is that there's no mediation. Even the law is now, increasingly something that becomes absolute. So as we said, I think in the first session briefly, after 1945, for some decades, we thought of the state and of the law as being essentially protecting individuals and societies from totalitarianism, from the horrors of the first half of the 20th century. And yet, in the course of the triumph of ultraliberalism in the last 30, 40 years, the law is now on the other side. The law is now not on the side of the vulnerable, the weak, those who need our protection most of all. It's now on the side of the strong, of the powerful, of the wealthy. Because the state and the law in particular have now become instruments for small groups to impose their will on everyone else. So you get, parliamentary time for assisted suicide, which is not in any party's manifesto as in any way a priority, and suddenly we are at great risk of legalizing assisted suicide because a small vocal group has essentially been able to impose its will on a majority and on something that no one in this country voted for. Right? That is where democracy has got to. The same with the liberalisation of abortion. That was not in any party manifesto, and yet it's become the law. Albeit that all the defendants will say it's just an exception and it will only apply to 1%, but that's not the point. The point is we have legalised it. So democracy is now not on the side of majorities, not on the side of certainly not the common good. It has now essentially become a tool for a totally corrupt oligarchy. And so the
the alternative to modern representation in general and to liberal democracy in particular is to recover notions of mediation, where will is mediated by intellect, where the fundamental metaphysical questions of truth, beauty and goodness are what structures political debate, and not proceduralism and not legalism, not utilitarian considerations. And where fundamentally we need to have not just representation through election, but that remains an important part of the polity. We need direct participation, more popular participation in power, as John and I argued in Politics of Virtue. We need more virtuous elites who can then also discern and help discern the truth, the good and the beautiful. And we also need crucially association. Human association, humans associating around shared ends. You know, what we sometimes wrongly call civil society, that's not the right idea, but all the corporate, economic, social and political bodies that should be participating in the polity. You know, a new form of economic and social corporatism where business, trade unions, mediated by government at different levels, come together and broker agreements, you know, do what Morris Guzman calls the reconciliation of estranged interests. That is the only way we can save democracy from itself. Participation, mediation and association. Without that, democracy will increasingly slide into what the ancients warned us already about. Demagogy, oligarchy, anarchy and ultimately tyranny. And if you don't think we've already had tyranny in modern times, besides the obvious examples of dictatorship, then remember both Adrian de la Boétie and Alexis de Tocqueville warning us. Some, you know, in Tocqueville's case, you know, about 200 years ago, and Adrian de la Boétie's even longer, that we can have something called the tyranny of voluntary servitude. That we become so obsequious and we will give in to this form of absolute tutelage. That is the great danger in the West. Not that we're going to have a dictatorship. You know, all these people saying that Trump's the next dictator is totally overblown. You know, the American Constitution is still there. And sometimes the problem is much more fundamental than Trump, or even the crisis of American institutions. The fundamental problem is that we are in great danger of giving into the tyranny of voluntary servitude. And that is, I think, the great threat lurking over the north. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Just sort of very briefly add that in terms of this idea of an analogy between modern epistemology and modern notions of representation, I think that if you've got the idea that our mind it simply represents, simply mirrors a reality out there, you're stuck in a kind of aporia. You know, you're either saying it's a real mirroring, or you're saying it's a substitution, and this is why you get the sort of oscillation between empiricism and idealism. And I think a similar thing is true in our politics. What does representation mean? You know, should MPs be simply carrying out the wills of their constituents, or are they total substitutes for, you know, have we elected? And I think if you return to the sort of model, the older model of knowledge by identity, that somehow the forms of things are transmuted in our mind. You know, the tree out there becomes a different tree in me, but there's a sort of continuity. The model you get in Aristotle and Aquinas, that, you know, then the political analogy is that yes, the representative has to be looking at the will of the people, but also wisely transmuting that into more details, and also assisting people with advice, because, you know, representation is both of, you know, the thing outside us, like the tree, and a kind of intimation of the eternal form of the tree, which alone brings the particular and the universal together. This is what the whole notion of a Platonic form, that's what it's supposed to resolve, you know, the idea that things can be both general and particular. And I think it's at that point that the historical genealogy of political representation is important, because undoubtedly its origins are Christological and ecclesiological. In other words, Christ is our representative, and then the bishop represents both, it takes on a Christological role. He represents the people to God and God to the people. And so, in the early centuries, bishops, to some extent, related by popular acclaim. So there was a democratic factor. But they're not just answerable to the people, they're also answerable to God. So we've got this paradoxical mixture, just as kings are like that. But all leaders need to be like that. They need to have the sense we are answerable to people, and the people, people are a test of the truth, accepting. But we're not just answerable to the people, else this will all switch round into manipulating the people, and people will just vote for what they think they want. And you will pervert. You've got to have this sense. In some sense, you're also trying to discern within where you are in time, God, the absolute, whatever you want to call it. Otherwise, everything breaks down.
That's right. And again, this is not just saying, oh, this is an ancient or medieval idea we must go back to. Throughout modern times, different voices have said just that, and they've developed this thinking rather than simply restated it. So famously, Edmund Burke, in the speech to the electors of Bristol, makes that very point. He says it's not just about opinion, it's not just about even the narrow interests of your constituents. It is about judgment. I'll quote from it very briefly, if I may. So basically saying that, you should be your MP should be using his, conscience and judgment. So it says, these he does not derive from your pleasure, no, nor from the law and the constitution. They are a trust from Providence. In other words, MPs are trustees. They're not merely mandated by the people, and that's not to be derogatory. For the abuse of which he is deeply answerable. Your representative owes you, this is the famous word, not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. And the whole point, of course, of Western philosophy, and indeed their analogues in other traditions, is that philosophy is not just about doxa, it's not just about opinion. Hence the importance of paradox. We have to go beyond mere opinion, mere taste. And to come back to something Alfred mentioned earlier, why are we now in a situation where everything is about vibes? It's the ultimate triumph of what the late Alistair McIntyre called emotivism. It's reducing everything to just our own feelings, as opposed to trying to discern something more enduring, discern patterns in what we experience. So this is not to be anti-experiential, on the contrary, we need to connect with people's lived experience a lot more than we have done. Again, it's part of the problem of the academy, that it's far too abstract and does not relate to people's lived experience at all, whether in the humanities or the social sciences, and that what we don't need is the triumph of emotivism as far as what we need is to say, what is the world out there for people, and why is it not working? How can we generally make it more fulfilling, more meaningful to them? And of course, the tragedy is that we're dealing with a class of politicians who are about as separate from common concerns as they could be, through their own ideological choices, to the fact that they have not had a job, they've gone into politics since their student days, and so many other things. But fundamentally, it's that, and we're not discussing metaphysical questions as metaphysical questions.
Yeah, I was, I think just linking the stuff on metaphysics of representation, political representation. One of the stories that sort of provoked was this story of Bernard Stiegler at the voting booth, and saying what shocked him politically was that he felt no affinity with the person next door voting for Le Pen. And so he links politics to aesthesis, because there is a sense in which the only way that you can have representation is to have not only substitution but the feeling of affinity. And I was thinking, just touching on the euthanasia debates, because I watched quite a lot of the first debate for the euthanasia bill, and how the discourse was carried out, I remember, was there was never really anyone who pointed out what kind of aesthetic judgment we have about life and death, and trying to find some kind of metaphysical discourse about that. A lot of the discourse was about safeguarding. And I remember there was one particular Liberal Democrat politician who wanted to get to the principles, but the principles that he was getting at were still procedural, because he was talking about, well, I object in principle, not just in terms of safeguarding procedure, because this won't maximize liberty. Now this is, the principle is still a procedure, it's a procedural principle, weirdly. I wanted to sort of draw this all in just to pose a question about how do you exactly begin circulating a metaphysical currency in discussion? Because when I discuss euthanasia with people who aren't interested in the metaphysical discussion, I can't find that point of affinity where I communicate with them. So that's one of the, because all of this between us, this work is there's some kind of indoxical process where we're beginning with similar starting points. But I find it very hard to enter into the same kind of discussion in a different context.
It's the $1 million question, isn't it? And somehow you have to show to people that sort of abstract metaphysical question links to their own direct experience. Like, is the question of the survival of your very old relative, is that just a matter of what she wants or what you want? Is that really doing justice to how you feel about them? And then, similarly with the sort of replacement of people by machines, do you really feel a machine can be equivalent to a human being in the way that it thinks, in inverted commas? Or are you happy with the idea that people are proceeding as if free will was an illusion? Or that, already we've got into a sexual discourse that's it's as if we think love is really an illusion, and we need to get to the level of our primal drives and release them and so on. But how's that working out, particularly for women? And I think the shift, particularly within British feminism here, is so significant that more and more British feminists seem to be sort of rediscovering the spiritual and the way in which supposed liberal progress is not actually on the side of women. So I think in effect our politics is becoming about the metaphysical. But as you say, there's a real difficulty in trying to relate people's. But I think we have to somehow show people, look, the whole discourses in which our experience is being talked about do violence to the way you naturally feel.
So again, the question is exactly the right one, and it's as brilliant as it is hard to answer. But I think again and again we can actually appeal to people's experience of what is not working. So why is that the beginnings of quite a major backlash of families against access for young people to the internet, to the point where you're now banning phones now, smartphones in schools is not very controversial at all. In fact, almost all schools have moved there and are raising the age every year. Every time the school year starts, there are more restrictions on using smartphones in schools.
They may be unilaterally banned everywhere for all under 16s in Australia.
Well, exactly. And why is that not creating a huge backlash? On the contrary, it's meeting with lots of support and approval by parents, because they've seen the devastating impact on older kids that they might have already had. So that they can see the destructive effect. And the moment you point out that something is dangerous to your kids, you bet that all families, religious, secular, of all social class, of all origins, will be mobilized and will step in to prevent harm. So even the harm principle is
one element of appeal. Now, I don't mean the harm principle in utilitarian sense alone, but the harm principle here is a broader and deeper principle. Protection, as I said earlier, the state and the law having protective functions, right, rather than exposing people to risk, which is what happens when you liberalise and supposedly decriminalise and just have choice and emancipation as the guiding principle. So the protective function of the law and of the state is, I think, something that still commands a lot of support, right? Whether it's to your children or indeed your relatives. If you, for instance, say to someone that their granny is going to be, pressurized into killing herself, a lot of people will actually up and say, hang on a minute, that's not at all what I thought euthanasia was. I thought euthanasia was, relieving intolerable pain, which of course we have to engage with as a reality. Who wants to be exposed to intolerable pain, and how can we, think of cases where that might be true? But I think when people find out the real consequences of emancipation, liberalisation, decriminalisation, I think they begin to see what's going on. Cannabis is the same thing. For a long time, there was a de facto consensus. Yeah, we should never decriminalise the weed. It's perfectly fine as a recreational thing, and actually the consequences are not harmful. They're incredibly harmful on mental health. So again and again, you can just point out how dangerous these things are by showing what it means in reality to people. And I still think there's a vast majority who are opposed to that breaking of taboos, that total transgressive culture that we've only really had normatively since the 60s, since the 1960s, with some antecedents in the Roaring 20s. This is quite a recent phenomenon. And I think, in another context, when you show how destructive short-term profit maximization is, short-term profit maximization was effectively brought about after Milton Friedman wrote his essay in 1971. It's a very, very recent thing. It's nothing, in human historical terms. And that also means it can be challenged and I think reversed. Just because it has not worked out for a vast majority of people. It's only worked out for a very, very small group of essentially oligarchs, or call them plutocrats if you prefer. And it's essentially been devastating for millions and millions of people. So let's absolutely appeal to people's lived experience and show that emancipation, liberalisation, decriminalisation, have not worked.
I like the example of having a baby. It seems like quite a common experience. People have a child and they start thinking about the social safety net. They might start off as libertarian, and then they have a child and they start thinking about the need for a social safety net or more stable family units and stuff. It does kind of this beautiful baby, whatever. It does sort of change markings.
Totally.
So if I could also loop back around to the theme of voluntary servitude in relation to this topic. So I think there's a big danger kind of on both sides of this, and you see this very much with the political polarization among young people, Generation Z, where it's even on both sort of sides of the polarization, you have kind of on one side this extreme anxiety about transgression, which tends to be localized to specific forms of transgression that are these are the bad kinds, and then kind of other kinds that maybe are sort of they're more liberal about for whatever reason, and sort of coalitions form around this. But then kind of the natural drift kind of happens on those liberal premises really is towards a kind of quasi-fascistic sort of idea of, well, because the worst thing possible is these kinds of transgressions, then the most necessary thing is just by whatever means necessary, preventing it. Yes, well, yes. I mean, the thing is, a lot of the fascism was a symbol of the French Revolution. This is something I like to bring up. That fascism is very much in that legacy. So the thing about it is that it's kind of you do have this problem with. I think it actually comes back to how people think about evil metaphysically. I think this is one of the fundamental aspects here. That the traditional, John has a great chapter on this, the first chapter of Being Reconciled is about this question of evil and how we think about evil. Is evil a privation of good, or is there kind of a positive evil in the human world, radical evil? I actually think that most people, sort of modern liberal, especially younger people who are more secular, without necessarily knowing it, effectively believe in the radical evil theory. That they think that there is kind of an intrinsic evil in the will, and that this needs to be controlled. And this leads to an extreme, a politics of total, very biopolitical, right? Politics of control, where it's the evil part of the human will, which might be localized in certain populations, needs to be controlled. And so that's sort of the limit of kind of saying like, well, look at all of these harms that are occurring. I think a lot of what ultimately has to happen on the other side of this is thinking of like, you know, well, but is there actually a good actuality that maybe the badness is itself kind of a limit on our approach to that? That this is sort of holding us back from something that isn't simply, you know, like a conservative state of like, we're just feeling comfortable. But I mean, maybe conservative in a different sense of like holding on to like traditional values of transcendence, right? And like sort of religious devotion. I feel like that's kind of thing that is actually required for people to have a more positive vision of like what's on the other side of like preventing all of these bad things and transgressions from occurring. Because like, I mean, when people kind of just got worked up into a frenzy and scared about all the bad things happening around them, you know, they just have to believe in goodness. There has to be some kind of case for goodness, even if it's not like, you know, in a standard religious
A
scenario.
really good example is paedophilia, which is seen as absolute evil. There's, you know, there's no discussion of why it's there, why it seems to be more prevalent, why it turns violent. It's seen as in total discontinuity with things that are, you know, just yesterday we'd have also seen as perversions to some degree. And so, and there's very little attempt to say, why is this happening? How can these people be helped? And so on. In other words, it's not dealt, you know, are the continuities between various normal modes of sexuality. None of these questions are asked anymore. It's as if, you know, as if Freud had never written a word. You know, he wasn't right about everything, but he certainly had some clear intuitions. I mean, can you even talk about childhood sexuality any longer? I'm not sure you can. I mean, this is a really good example of a failure to think in progression.
Yeah. And I think the other example here is what we see increasingly, which is a backlash against pornography. That, you know, pornography was much more acceptable at some point, and now that it's become incredibly radicalized and you know, even more depraved than it always, you know, was, you know, there's the beginning of the backlash. And this idea that, you know, everyone wants to experience some form of choking and so on, it just turns out there's very, very few individuals who, again, through their incredible influence and power have imposed this as apparently a new norm, when actually almost all people who've ever tried this would say no, absolutely not. I mean, besides the very real dangers to, you know, to women, you know, who are also the sisters and daughters and so on of people who then find out that their loved one perished in some, you know, horrendous experiment. So we're seeing both things that we discussed in the first session already, an ever greater sort of depraved set of practices on the one hand, perpetuated through, you know, various processes and institutions on the one hand, but also, I think, more and more popular, you know, rejection. And then the question is at what point, you know, can that mobilize and build up into a much greater popular resistance to these elite minority phenomena? Because they're absolutely not shared by the majority of people. So we can actually, again, appeal to what George Orwell called common decency, to say that actually in the name of common decency we reject these things. And I think you can build even the politics ultimately around some of that.
Alfred.
Thank you. I was, funnily enough, I'm really glad that the question of voluntary servitude was raised, and also the little aside you made about the theory of radical evil presented at the being reconciled. Just because to say, no wonder something that is seen as so abhorrent is subject to possibly the most easy, potent form of rationalization that exists, which is to say, the thing about me that I hold to be detestable must come from outside me, it must be something that's foreign to me, it must be expunged. It's also precisely this kind of rationalization that by saying there is a part of myself that is identifiable, that I must loathe and that I must suppress, that makes it such an easy auto-eroticizing relation. And I was going to say on the question of voluntary servitude, I think has become so prevalent because of two, well, primarily because of apathy, but I'm very interested in the way that voluntary servitude can itself become eroticized. The question I was going to ask was really pragmatic, but it began with a brief explication of where I think this apathy comes from, which is to say, in Adrian's initial contribution, we hold there to be standards of virtue in representative democracy, because we would see the democratic representative as being an extension of ourselves, and therefore they ought to not merely do their tie-up and sing the national anthem, but there should also be something about them that necessarily singles them out to merit the status of being elected as representative.
Yep.
Now, while I completely agree, and I think it's almost like a truism to say this is the case, normally the mention of standards of virtue in the context of British representative democracy leave people with their tongues planted firmly in their cheeks. And going back to Parnell, Profumo, Jeremy Thorpe, Jesus, then and then I believe the years. Poor dog. That's what my grandmother always used to say. That poor dog. Oh, it's that poor dog. Never mind, potentially dead man. And then there are the years of the 90s of what were referred to as Tory sleaze, football shirts and, love children and cool girls and so on. But today, we live in the most permissive, post-Berlusconi possible world of morality and representative democracy, whereby, Boris Johnson being unable to name how many love children he has fathered. Never mind Trump. There are numerous, individual cases in my country, but God knows how many there are in the United States, Matt Gaetz, etc. It's almost as though people used to call Ronald Reagan Teflon Ron, but with microplastics being more prevalent today than at any point in the past, everybody now wears a Teflon coat in politics. So consequently, I was going to say, if the way to re-enchant an institution is the way to make it something that everybody feels like they participate in legitimately, in the same way that liturgy is participation, the living connection of lived experiences, then, and this is also partly an excuse to restate some of the arguments made in Politics of Virtue, what can we do when liberal democracy holds voting up as a kind of sacrament, as a kind of secular liturgy? And this is one of the reasons I think that it's so inveterately hostile to the idea of political decision makers that are not subject to a direct democratic liberal vote. It's one of the reasons that when people use the C word, corporatism, that we're normally put in mind of Salazar, Mussolini, fascism, Mosley, when there would surely be something that seems eminently reasonable about the idea of should there not be a representative of the plumbers guild in this country having a decision-making say, should there not be a representative of any such labour guild. But yes, so I was going to ask, what would you suggest materially as ways of re-enchanting the institution? Are there any purely kind of, I hate to use the word procedural because we all don't like it, but are there any sort of pragmatic things we can do to the structure of cabinet governance in this country in order to make it more acquisite, more dramatic, more appropriate? And then to the question of voluntary servitude, what is, in a sense, would this then be, if we have this institution in place, a material solution to the problem of people who are so apathetic because all their representatives are morally bankrupt, or even worse, they essentially fetishise their position of political apathy? It's one of the reasons that liberal commentators seem to reach for all of this strange Freudian language. Angela Merkel is a mother figure, or on the flip side, we're searching for big, strong Chaldeos that can lead us out of that particular quandary.
There was also a question online from the first one, right?
Yeah.
I just thought we might take the questions together.
Yes.
We've only got 5.
Yeah, let's take the question.
Okay, this is quite a long question, but it's basically about Christian communism.
Christian communism.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay. There's a paradox.
We'll see. So J.P. Wall says, it's quite a long question. It is interesting that a panel of theologians have spoken so much of the principle of vox populi and themes of mass politics, true democracy. Professor Pabst,
Yes.
alluded to a vanguardist sense of having intellectual and institutional readiness for the tipping point of the social crisis, exclamation mark. The revelation moment, I believe, was even spoken of as proceeding through grace. I am reminded of Gregory Gabon, the renegade preacher of St. Petersburg from the 1905 revolution in Russia. My question is for Peter Pabst, but also if the rest, if interested. I think I love the argument to me.
My new first name.
Father Gapon was
My question, I'll try to my question for Peter Pabst,
Yeah, well done.
but also the rest if interested, when it comes to escaping the vacillation of anarchy and tyranny in modernity as you speak of it, Is a kind of religious communism needed? The mantle of a Feuerbach-influenced Marxian humanist cult of man as a universal organising principle appears to have failed after the fall of the USSR. Does the forthcoming crisis need a revolutionary political left Christendom more potent than the mere declarations of rerum novarum?
Okay, so you answer that and
And
then we go for lunch.
And then we have lunch. Okay, so let me try and be mercifully short for a change. No, we don't need a Christian communism, but I don't think that would really work at all. No dictatorship of the proletariat, no mass nationalisation of the forces of production. This has all been tried. What we need is a Christian socialism, which is very different from communism, because it's all about the person, it's all about relationality, it's all about creating the institutions and associations that allow people to govern themselves and each other in a much more democratic way, that is much more decentralised in terms of either state power or market concentration. So we essentially need a kind of Christian guild socialism. That's really the way, but of course it needs to be adapted for our time. So what do we do at tech platforms? My view is that we turn them into public utilities, so they're not owned by the state, they're not nationalised, but nor are they in the hands of private oligarchs. They become a public utility in which people can then offer computing services, right? But they remain public utilities, just like we need public utilities in water, electricity, right? The rails and all the things that are common usage. So I'm very much, with all the economists who talk about, the global and indeed the local and national commons, we need to restore the commons against the enclosure, against essentially things that create the conditions for capitalism. And that means we need, intermediary institutions. We need to pluralize the state. We need to make the state more plural and associative, and we need to neutralize markets. But we don't need Christian communism. On Alfred's very good question, I suppose. There's a number of things we advocated in the politics of virtue that I think we remain, absolutely committed to. But of course, there are more things that need to be done besides what I just mentioned. I mean, one is, if we are going to have a constitutional monarchy, then we need to repoliticise the crown. And that means the Privy Council should not be just the government of the day, and whoever else was made a Privy Councillor. In the past, we actually want the crown to choose people of experience, dare I say of wisdom, who should indeed advise the monarch. We then need to have a completely different vetting system for members of the House of Lords, not the current system where all manner of failed politicians and, frankly, often corrupt donors end up in the House of Lords. We need people of true distinction from all the professions. So yes, we need an associative House of Lords that represents society, the country, in terms of mayors, in terms of professions, and in terms of faith communities. I would want to maintain the Anglican bishops in the House of Lords, but I also want to see Catholic figures, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, other figures bring their voice to the upper chamber. So I have a completely different composition of the House of Lords. And by the way, of course, I would want to maintain the hereditary peers and not abolish them as the government is proposing. No, absolutely. And of course, absolutely make sure that, the notion of land ownership for everyone, whether they're a member of the House of Lords or not, comes with a much greater sense of duty. To the land, to the people on the land, to the communities that are adjacent, and so on and so forth. So really what we need is not a politics of rights and utility, which is what we've had. We need a politics of virtue and of obligation. And if we can inculcate that sense, then I think we can move towards a better group of electors as well. But of course, when it comes to inculcating a sense of virtue and a sense of obligation, that can only happen through culture and education, which is by itself a long-term thing. We cannot bring this about in a matter of years. But if we can have the institutions, starting with the family, with primary, secondary school, of course, but also other institutions that form character and inculcate virtue, then I think there is a way back from the current system. And again, having better MPs as well, ultimately. That means we have to change the parties, we have to change the way people are selected before they're even up for vote. I mean, in the politics of virtue, and I'll finish on this, we also thought that single constituency